Hello, welcome to the Ascent of Mount Carmel YouTube channel. This channel is devoted to a reading and better understanding of the book Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. Today we're on the 14th chapter of the second book. In the last chapter, St. John provided us with the three signs for when it's time to put our imagination aside when we're praying or thinking or meditating about supernatural things. They are when we no longer have pleasure when we use our imagination, when we no longer enjoy fixing our attention on certain entities or objects, and when we realize that we are already waiting in silent and loving attentiveness for God. If we ignore these signs and stick to what we have been doing all along, we'll have less pleasure or profit from prayer and meditation. St. John defines meditation as reasoning with the faculties of the sense. In this chapter, St. John gives us a couple more reasons why we might put aside meditation and reasoning with the faculties of the senses. The first reason for this is that the soul has already received all the spiritual good that it can from meditation and reasoning. We're going to know whether we're at that point when we realize that we can no longer meditate or reason in the same way as we did before. We won't feel that same sweetness or pleasure that we had felt earlier. St. John tells us that as a rule, whenever a soul receives a spiritual blessing, the spirit finds it to be pleasurable, and in that way it better profits by it. Please note that spiritual blessings are not the same thing as tangible sensual blessings, and often spiritual blessings come as a result of sensual hardships. The second reason is that the soul has already formed a habit of meditation. The goal of meditation on things of God is to gain knowledge and love of God. And each time that the soul gains knowledge through meditation, it's an act. And by repeatedly performing these acts, we form a habit in the soul. Now, when we advance to the next stage, which we're going to talk about in this chapter, the knowledge that we gain will not be so specific, and it will be more of a loving and general knowledge that we gain. And St. John compares our reception of this knowledge to a person to whom water has been brought. That person drinks it peacefully and without labor. He doesn't have to get the water by laboriously cranking a hand pump. In the same way, as we advance, we won't have to labor for this general knowledge. St. John describes this knowledge as being confused, loving, passive, and tranquil. Our souls feel a great weariness and foul taste when they're in a state of tranquil contemplation and in a state that would be receptive to the loving general knowledge, but then as a part of our self-discipline, with our will, we force our souls to meditate and labor on images and go back to using our intellectual faculties. And when this happens, the soul is like a little infant that was peacefully breastfeeding, but then it's suddenly separated from its mother's breast and then forced to try to find its nourishment on its own by groping about. In the United States, basketball announcers talk about how players must try not to do too much. They must play within themselves and let the game to come to them. That's sort of the same thing that we're talking about here with this loving and general knowledge. We let it come to us. Most people probably assume that progress or enlightenment will only come from continual reasoning and learning in order to better understand things. And they assume that if they stop reasoning with the faculties of the senses, they're going to backslide. They'd probably assume that waiting in silent contemplation would actually be a waste of time, especially because while they're in that state, they're not going to necessarily understand anything clearly. So these people keep on doing the same old thing in the name of self-discipline, even though they really don't enjoy it or really make any further progress. And when they realize that they aren't making progress, they just redouble their efforts. However, the lack of understanding that they're afraid of would actually enable them to penetrate into the dark night of the soul. And it's only by passing through the dark night that we can be united with God. And that union will transcend all knowledge that they could possibly hope to gain. An important reason that we shouldn't put aside meditation and imagination too early is that if we haven't built up our knowledge of God and aren't properly catechized, we probably won't be able to enter into this contemplation in the first place. The house that we're trying to build would be built on a poor foundation.
Like a house that's built of toothpicks stacked upon a kitchen table. One last toothpick tore it down, the foundation was not able.
The use of meditation and imagination helps us to reason and search out and gain knowledge. That's our first step, and it prepares us for the next stage, where we're going to use our spiritual faculties and reach the fruition of the knowledge that we already received the faculties of the sense in this earlier stage. And even though those faculties won't take any part in the process in this next stage, they help pave the road for us. The difference between the faculties of the senses and the faculties of the spirit are like the differences between working and enjoying the fruit of the work that's already been performed. Or it's like between the labor of journeying and then the rest and quiet which comes once you reach your destination. Or again, it's like the difference between preparing a meal and then eating it. As we learn to rely on our spiritual faculties, the general loving knowledge that St. John is talking about can be so subtle and delicate that we're not even going to notice that we're receiving it. St. John explains how this can be through this comparison. The spiritual faculties are like a ray of sunlight entering the house through a window. And if the room is full of dust floating about in the air, the light's going to illuminate that dust and draw our attention to it and draw our attention to the light. However, when the air is totally clean and the window is spotless, we really don't notice that ray of light because it's pure, clear, simple, and perfect. When the light is clear and not noticeable, it's actually kind of like darkness to our senses because we don't notice it. And with this pure light, there are no objects like dust or anything for us to focus upon, and it's completely unnoticed. And the same thing happens in the realm of spiritual light. This general and supernatural knowledge radiates purely and simply. It's so completely detached and removed from all intelligible objects of our understanding that it can't be perceived or observed. And when this light is at its purest, it's actually the darkest to our senses because it withdraws from our understanding and from our accustomed lights, forms, and imagination. Most of the times, for most people, this divine light is going to radiate upon us with moderate force, and we won't perceive either the darkness or the light, and we're not going to apprehend anything that we know or can recognize. But we gain this loving general knowledge as a result, and occasionally our souls will experience a state of great forgetfulness. We might suddenly realize that we don't remember where we've been or what we've done. Mostly, however, we won't realize the passage of time, and this will probably occur during prayer. Perhaps prayer in front of the Eucharist, and somewhere between an Our Father and a Hail Mary, we'll sort of get lost. And we'll be pretty sure that we weren't daydreaming or thinking about anything that wasn't of God, but at the same time, we really won't remember anything. And hours might be spent in this forgetfulness, and when we return to ourselves, and it's going to seem like hardly any time has passed, but then we'll check our watches and we'll see that, yeah, a lot of time has passed. And St. John says that this type of prayer pierces the heavens because it doesn't belong to time. In this type of prayer, the soul becomes united to pure intelligence, and that pure intelligence isn't limited by time. The cause of this forgetfulness is the pure and simple knowledge that occupies the soul and simplifies, purifies, and cleanses it of the apprehensions and forms of the senses and memory. Normally, we're conscious of and dependent upon time, but when it's no longer relevant, we're left in a state of forgetfulness and lose our sense of time. And when the soul awakens, the imparted general knowledge leaves an effect upon the soul without us even being conscious of it. Although while we're in this state, we probably feel like we aren't really doing anything and our soul is entirely unoccupied because it isn't working with either the senses or the faculties. We are not wasting time. I sleep and my heart watcheth. This means that although we're not laboring and we're asleep to our natural selves, our hearts and souls are awakened, and we're supernaturally lifted up by supernatural knowledge. It should be noted that the imparting of this loving general knowledge won't cause forgetfulness on a daily basis, and it's going to be an unusual occurrence. And it's only going to happen when we cooperate with God in suspending the exercise of all the faculties and the soul is entirely filled with the loving general knowledge. To reach this state, the understanding has to be withdrawn from both temporal and spiritual knowledge, and we shouldn't have any desire to think about either, because when we're doing so, it means that our soul is occupied, and we want to be totally unoccupied. And when this type of knowledge is imparted, the soul is only conscious of a sweetness and love, without any knowledge or understanding about the feeling or its nature. It's for this reason that St. John calls this supernatural knowledge as being loving and general knowledge. And it's communicated obscurely to the understanding and to the will, with the sweetness and love being communicated so esoterically, the soul can't have a distinct knowledge of what's happening or even the object of its love. Well, I hope you enjoyed this installment. We'll be back in about a week with the next one. In the meantime, please pray for the church.